can fully convey the deep sense of disappointment and disillusion which the government and people of Nigeria felt when they heard the news of Soviet armed intervention in Afghanistan, a third world developing non-aligned country which posed no immediate threat to the peace and security of the Soviet Union.
The countries of the Third World and the developing nations had believed, perhaps optimistically, that the time had passed when the major powers would send their soldiers and tanks into small countries, and that warlike aggression had been ruled out as legitimate conduct in international life. But they were mistaken.
Die meisten Entwicklungsländer haben in ihrer Entscheidung unmissverständlich zum Ausdruck gebracht, dass sie die Vorgehensweise der UdSSR missbilligen. Die finale Abstimmung über einen sofortigen Rückzug der sowjetischen Truppen aus Afghanistan ging dementsprechend mit 104 Ja zu lediglich 18 Nein-Stimmen, mehr als überaus deutlich. Ein nahezu identisches Ergebnis ergab sich wenig später ebenso bei der Versammlung der 42 muslimischen Nationen. Und im November 1981 erging eine weitere Resolution an die Botschafter in der UN. Der Außenminister Malaysias brachte in seiner Rede zum Ausdruck, dass die Dinge, welche sich in Afghanistan ereigneten, ein großer Grund zur Besorgnis wären.
Particularly the small developing nations who are anxious to free ourselves from external power domination and influence and consolidate our hard-won independence on the basis of the policy of non-alignment. The fact that the Soviet Union was not mentioned by name in the communique of the non-aligned movement relating to the situation in Afghanistan could not hide our deep disappointment and indignation at the action of a superpower that often claims itself to be a supporter.
Und wieder gab es nach der folgenden Abstimmung ein mehr als deutliches Ergebnis, mit dem Ziel, dass sich die sowjetischen Truppen umgehend aus Afghanistan zurückziehen sollten. 116 Nationen stimmten dafür, 23 dagegen.
The reaction of Third World was rather strong, unexpectedly strong. More than anybody could expect it, and probably for the first time since 50s, the majority of the countries in the United Nations condemned the Soviet aggression.
Der unabhängige Filmemacher und ehemalige Offizier der britischen Armee, Nick Downing, hat seit geraumer Zeit die militärische Vorgehensweise der Sowjetunion in Afghanistan beobachtet.
So that was during 1980. The sort of psychological shock to the guerrillas of this sudden influx of Russian troops did seem to set them back. I mean, they almost seemed to be stunned by it. And the Russians did, with the Afghan army, take back fairly large areas which they'd lost in the previous 18 months fighting before the Russian invasion. And then the Russians, from what I can gather, having re-established the bases in the countryside, withdrew to the main towns, to the main garrisons, and left the Afghan army to hold the areas they'd retaken. And in this last year, 1981, the guerrillas, in many cases, retook the land which they'd lost the year before. And so now the situation is very much the same as it was in 1979 before the Russian invasion. And in some ways, from the government point of view, it's much worse. Mm-hmm.
Michael Berry, Abgeordneter der Internationalen Föderation zum Schutz der Menschenrechte, hat fast 10 Jahre seines Lebens in Afghanistan verbracht.
Apparently, the Soviets had felt that simply bringing in their tanks into the country would be enough to terrorize the population into submission. And seeing that this was not the case, they launched a total war attack. There was a wave of helicopter fire. Parachute troops were landed on the houses. parachute troops went into the houses and simply shot everybody in them, forcing the population either to run away or die on the spot.
Der Korrespondent des Christian Science Monitors, Edward Girardet, hat mehrere Reisen in Afghanistan unternommen und sich dabei vom Zustand der Flüchtlingslager überzeugt.
I visited numerous camps along the Pakistan-Afghan border. There are now an estimated 2.5 million refugees, legal refugees, inside Pakistan, and they're still coming over. The guerrillas leave their families in Pakistan, and then groups go back inside, maybe to fight 3, 4, 5, 10 weeks, whatever it be, also to collect supplies. But I think that also they are justified in bringing their families because there's been a lot of bombing going on of villages. And in some parts, they just cannot survive. The farms have been destroyed, their food storages have been destroyed. And I think this is one tactic of the Soviets to destroy food, to try and burn the crops just before harvest time. And so, of course, what are these people going to live on? They have to leave the country. And I think this, of course, serves the purposes of the Soviet Union to try and remove people from certain areas so as to reduce the resistance or the ability of the locals to support the resistance.
Elsewhere, the Soviets are seeding the country with mines which not only hurt children, especially, who have trouble identifying these objects which blend very well with the terrain, but also these mines are destroying the flocks. The goats, the sheep, the cattle are walking on these mines and blowing up on them. So through a combination of starvation tactics, bombing, wholesale attacks of villages, they will keep the pressure on a particular village so hot that they will force the population to flee.
Der bekannte Autor und Leiter der INA in Paris, Professor Gérard Charlion, gibt dazu Auskunft.
Well, the main tactic is, of course, to remain in the cities, to hold them tightly, to create law and order, especially in Kabul, and also to control communications. They do that essentially with tanks. If they are attacked, they send immediately their helicopters, and their losses are moderate. On the other hand, they really are not controlling the country. It's a big country, populated by at least 15 million people. There are around 90,000 Soviet troops, which is not enough to control a country of 50 million people, which is big like France. And I think their choice is politically at this stage and militarily to keep a low profile, to make hit-and-run big operations wherever the Mudschahidin are too strong, for instance, in provinces like Kunar, in the valley of Panjshir, not far from Kabul, or in the city of Kandahar.
Regarde, ça tire par là. Attention, tu me tires la câble là.
Apart from purely military operations, there is absolutely no attempt to use that overworked phrase, win the hearts and minds, which is an essential part of any counter-guerrilla campaign. They're just sitting there, and it is, or it looks like, a holding operation, as if the order has come from Moscow. This war is to be fought as cheaply as possible.
Well, the Soviets are using a hot and cold strategy, which consists of hitting one populated valley very hard and destroying the population, forcing it to flee or killing it, actually, in order to convince other populations in other valleys that resistance is absolutely hopeless. And because the Soviets so far have not been able to convince the population of the hopelessness of any resistance, they have been forced to rely increasingly on such terror tactics.